Welcome to More Than Sunday, the podcast that aims to help you on your journey of discipleship, not just on Sundays, but on every other day of the week as well. You're listening to episode 3 with me, Eve Powers, and Hannah Malcolm. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
Here she is. So the purpose of these podcasts is to give each and every one of us the opportunity to consider the role our faith plays in our everyday lives. And we would love your contributions as the year goes on.
Yes, we want this podcast to be a living reflection of faith and discipleship in our diocese. So please do contact us about any of the issues we discuss during these podcasts or any of the topics we will cover for upcoming ones.
You can get in touch with us in lots of different ways. You can email us at morethansunday@manchester.anglican.org or tweet using the hashtag MoreThanSunday or join our Facebook discipleship group. You know you want to. Just search More Than Sunday on Facebook. So our theme this month is creation. What is our role in caring for God's creation?
Is it a requirement for being a disciple? And what does it mean in practice?
So, here to discuss creation with us are two incredible guests. Curate at St Edmund's and St James Moss Side and eco-church pioneer Grace Thomas. Here she is.
Hi.
And Caleb Gordon, who is originally from Alaska and is now studying for a PhD in environmental ethics and beauty at the University of Manchester. Wow. Hi, Caleb.
Hello.
So welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us what being a disciple means to you, Grace?
OK, well, I think at its most basic, being a disciple means to me, it means being a believer in Christ and following as much as possible, or trying to follow the way of Jesus. The word disciple, I learned that it comes from the root to learn, to be a learner. And for me, that really represents the journey of discipleship that we make. We're learning and we're following. We're not leading the way. We're learning from Christ.
And how does that manifest itself in your life now and in the journey you've taken to become a curate as you are?
Well, it's been a very long journey. I think what it basically means for me is that I'm very aware that this is a continuous journey, that the journey started when I was a child and I was very aware that God was there. And as it's grown, as I've become more aware of what that means and understood more about what the way of Christ means and developed that into what that then means to me. And that has really led me on the journey to ordination and my current job.
Brilliant. And Caleb, I'm going to ask you the same question as we put to Grace. What does discipleship mean in your life?
Yeah, I think Grace had a really good answer and said a lot of the same things that come to mind for me, especially just the fact that discipleship is about learning. To be a disciple of someone is to kind of hold them in a certain kind of regard where you're taking your lead from them. And so if we're Christians, we're trying to take our lead from Christ in this particular way, in the way that we call discipleship. So obviously we have the Bible, we have the Gospels, and we can read about Jesus there, but I'm also very interested in the other ways that we can try and follow Christ, the other ways that we can take his lead.
In what ways does that manifest itself for you?
Well, coming from Alaska and moving to a couple places across the world, I think about the role of wilderness, the way that wilderness factors into my awareness of God. And I also think about the examples of others seeking wilderness in their own pursuit of God in the scriptures and elsewhere. I think there's this really interesting pattern of prophets, as well as Jesus himself. In fact, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went into the wilderness for 40 days, and not to mention the fact that he was baptized by someone who lived in the wilderness. And so there's this sense that people would sort of depart from society, from the things that they knew, the built environment, if you will, to go kind of be alone in creation, and that somehow that experience or that environment would kind of mediate a new awareness of God's will. And so if, as disciples, we're trying to take our lead from God via Christ, I think it's really interesting to think about the role that places play in that process, and how going and seeking out certain places as a place where we can discern what Christ wants of us is a really important part of discipleship.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting to think that, for a lot of our listeners, they won't be from Alaska, or maybe won't have had that experience of wilderness, and how much places shape our individual discipleship journeys. Grace, you aren't from Alaska.
No.
And you've had, you and Caleb have both come with this real passion for caring for creation and consider it to be part of your discipleship journeys. But you've come at it from quite distinct backgrounds. So how has being being in your particular context shaped that journey for you?
I think it was very interesting what Caleb was saying about wilderness, and that that decision sometimes to take yourself away and into a place of wilderness to somehow discern where God may be calling you. I live in and have always lived in a very urban context where taking yourself away into a place of wilderness is not really something that you can easily do. Two things came to my mind as Caleb was talking. One was the fact that often within our communities there are people in wildernesses that they do not wish to be in. There's a lot of stuff about social isolation and the wildernesses that they find themselves in within a very busy urban context. But also, even within urban contexts, there are places of beauty and places of creation that we sometimes don't notice as much as we should, and that can be places that are really cherished. Within our two very urban churches, we have an enormous park, which has really become a haven for people in amongst all the urban, buildings and traffic. And people talk about that very much as a place where they go and they can be. So even within an urban context, there are places where you can still find a little bit of wilderness.
I think it's a really interesting thing. As many people will know, we at the Manchester Diocese are trying to become an eco-diocese, and a lot of our churches are on journeys to become eco-churches. And Grace, your churches are on that journey. Yes. I think it's really interesting that a great deal of our more rural churches became early adopters of eco-church, but actually now we're having this real surge in many of our urban churches towards environmental choices. Why is it that the eco-choices and the environment are becoming more and more relevant to a congregation like yours, which is, as you say, in the middle of Moss Side on a very busy road? Yes. What does it mean to you and your congregation?
Well, I think the first thing that the eco-church journey has meant for us is recognising that we can do it even in a relatively deprived urban context. There is a kind of vision of eco-church being this countrified, church in the middle of fields and where you can see and touch nature very easily. But actually, as I've already mentioned, we have places of nature within our urban context, but more than that, we are affected directly by issues of pollution and climate change because we are directly on one of the busiest routes into Manchester, which has been proven to have a very high and dangerously high level of pollution. And these kind of issues have really helped our congregation to think about their own responsibility, but also think about how they need to be a voice of action, so that they can help their local communities thrive in a way that they didn't necessarily imagine they could.
I love that idea that there's maybe a turning point or a trigger point for different communities where they might start to recognise that this is actually affecting them as well. And so if you're in a rural context, that might be something very different to if you're right on Princess Road. So for both of our guests, Grace and Caleb, is there maybe a turning point or an experience that you've had in your lives that has been perhaps a trigger for getting you to think more deeply and more carefully about what it means to care for creation as a disciple? Can you identify maybe what that turning point was? Caleb, we'll come to you first.
I mean, I guess I've already mentioned that the transitions between Alaska and the other places that I've lived have been quite sharp. And
where else have you lived? Sorry.
So I moved from Alaska to New Haven, Connecticut, and then from there to the UK. And actually, I would always tell people that moving from Alaska to Connecticut was a bigger culture shock than moving from Connecticut to the UK, because Alaska is that unique, actually. That's the point there, I think. But it's easy to take it for granted, especially as a child growing up there without having another reference point. And so moving to the east coast of the United States and really experiencing for the first time a kind of urban landscape that just didn't really end, right? Like I lived in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the main city, about 300,000 people, and it's urban, but it also ends fairly abruptly and just turns into mountains and wilderness. But just that experience of not actually being able to just go out into wilderness, going out into uninterrupted trees, made me appreciate it in a different way. Now, I think it's also really important what Grace was saying about being able to identify what's wild and natural around you and appreciating that. And one part of that is, of course, noting how a lack of greenery affects things like air pollution, right? That's maybe one of our first sort of red flags, right? That we need to appreciate something more. But I'm also really interested in the ways that, again, it kind of orients us to our calling as Christians, and how maybe that extends beyond ourselves. And so lately I've become really interested, too, in thinking about the cultivation of spaces around me for wildlife, for the natural, non-human world, and what that looks like. And this is in terms, one, of noting that living in what's basically a dead city with no living creatures except for humans is actually not very good for us.
No.
But also we're just missing out on a lot. And so just things like going out into your local parks for a litter pickup, just to kind of help restore some of that potential vibrancy, or just going out into your alley and putting some more flowers and things back there to just help out the bees and everything else that will benefit from that, I think is something that has become an interest of mine that didn't exist in a way when I could just I could get to a forest in 15 minutes
Yeah.
in the back of my house. So it's made me feel it's given me more of an intentional sense of my responsibility to the places which immediately surround me.
It's really interesting. And Grace, for you, what has there been a trigger point? Is there maybe something that you identify as a wake-up call to think about creation as part of discipleship?
I think it's been a gentle journey for me. I think the awareness of climate change and greenhouse gases has been around for about 40 years, and I remember at primary school doing an assembly about Friends of the Earth. However, what I've really noticed and what I've reflected upon is that as I've grown up, I've become very busy. I lead a very busy lifestyle, and at times that has meant that convenience has become a priority. And during my training, I did a lot of reflection on well-being and self-care, and then I framed that within a wider doctrine of creation, looking at creation being about care for self, care for neighbour, and care for the world, and those three factors being equally important. And I began to think about this idea of convenience and how we've kind of idolised a fast pace and things needing to be done very quickly. Ruth Valerio, in her book L is for Living, reminds us that we've become cocooned in a culture that sees inconvenience as one of the greatest evils.
Yeah.
And I've had to reflect quite a lot on that, what that means for me and my own well-being, and also what it means for the world that I'm living in and my impact on that world. And so I've come from that perspective, really. I was really interested in what Caleb was saying about taking it out of ourselves and looking at our responsibility to other people as well, and the impact that our actions are having not only with our neighbours but also across the world, and our call as followers of Christ to love our neighbour and to take that seriously means that we really do have to look at these aspects of convenience and these aspects of greed that we have so naturally just built into our lives, and look at what they are doing not only to ourselves but also to the wider world.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you.
Hannah, I think it'd actually be really great to hear from you on this. You're about to start your ordination training this month, in fact, alongside doing a PhD in the theology of climate grief, following your win at the inaugural Church Times Theology Slam earlier this year on a similar topic. So could you tell us a little bit about that and how that work fits in with your everyday discipleship?
Great shout out to the Church Times Theology Slam, by the way.
You're listening, Church Times.
It's back next year. I think for me, the important thing has been recognising that the rest of creation and my relationship to it and God's relationship to it isn't a single issue thing. It's not an optional extra. So the fact that I'm part of creation too, that I depend on it and it depends on me, has been really crucial for my understanding. And also then, if that's true, every other part of my discipleship journey, whether that's serving others or seeking justice or discipling people or sharing my faith, is shaped by the knowledge that I am a loved part of creation, along with everything else. So one of my favourite bits of church liturgy in the whole year is the bit that we say on Ash Wednesday. We say, "Almighty and everlasting God, you hate nothing that you have made." And I think that gets to the heart of it for me, that we're a created being like all other created things, and that we're loved by God and that we're part of that network or community of creation. And so for me, trying to live that out is what being a disciple has looked like.
So can you explain what climate grief is? What kind of got you started on thinking about theology and the environment together?
I think for me, the specific area of climate grief and why I wanted to talk about that is that I think one of the challenges we have in the church around environment, eco stuff, climate change is that a lot of us are still just about getting to the point where we're going, you know what, we should really recycle more. Like, that would be great. And that's a really good first step. But people's experiences of the world, in particular, as they experience breakdown of like environmental systems around them, have moved beyond that to places of deep grief and anxiety. And of course, there's a real spectrum there. So the experience of climate grief by someone who is in a farming community in India and has their livelihood threatened and their life threatened by it is very difficult, like very different to the experience of like anxiety that I get. You know, I can't watch nature documentaries anymore because I can't watch another polar bear die. But there's the spectrum that a lot of us are living on. And the thing that I found really interesting is that when I talk to people about this thing that I'm interested in getting people to talk more about, people start to confess their bit of climate anxiety or climate grief to me that they're holding on to, that maybe it's they're really worried for their children or their grandchildren and they don't know what kind of world they're going to have. You know, maybe it is that they can't hear birdsong anymore in the place that they grew up. And the thing that is fascinating to me is that those things, if it's true that we're part of this creation, those things are the natural and the healthy responses to seeing things get broken and things die around you. And so if this is a growing experience for lots of people, then it tells us something about ourselves and our relationship to God and the world around us. And so we need to start finding ways to talk about it.
You're also part of a Christian climate action group. What sort of work are you doing with them?
Yeah, so I was involved in helping to set up the Christian Climate Action Group in Manchester. Christian Climate Action is an organisation that take non-violent direct action in light of climate breakdown. So that means that they will go and do actions that disrupt the ways that things normally work. So, you know, whether that's like marching in a protest, whether that's trying to shut down a building. They've been around for quite a long time, and they now have focused a lot of their energy on supporting actions done by other groups like Extinction Rebellion or like School Strike for Climate. And some of the actions people get arrested in. Sometimes they don't, and some people get involved because they just want to support other people that are involved in that kind of protest. But I suppose it's about thinking about the ways that as Christians we try to stand up against injustice and what that means as part of being a disciple and being faithful in the light of that kind of injustice, and how we should respond to it. So it's a quite controversial one. I know that not everyone listening will think that's what Christians should be doing, and it'd be great to hear people's reflections or experiences on what that might mean, you know, what they think the right way to respond is. And I think it's an ongoing conversation. But for me, that's been part of trying to be faithful as a disciple in light of what I know. I'm wondering, for both of you, as people that are really heavily engaged with this stuff on a regular basis. It's unavoidable, the constant stream of updates in the news about our climate crisis, about the emergency that we're facing and the need for action. We're living in a time of protest, a time of a desire for change, and also a lot of resistance to that. And I think it can feel quite frightening because we don't feel like we're in control. And I'm wondering whether you can reflect a little bit on what it means to be a disciple in that kind of environment. How do you have hope? Do you have hope? What are the impacts of your relationship with God as a result of the climate crisis that we're living in, and how do you navigate that? We'll come to Grace first this time.
So I think one of the things about discipleship is that it doesn't exist as a one person. A discipleship to me is done with other people. Jesus had 12 disciples. It's a group thing. So the first thing to take is that we are part of a collective and that we can support each other. Sometimes, I mean, the level of and the magnitude of what could happen can be so overwhelming that it can kind of paralyse us. But if we can look at ways in which together we can work collaboratively as fellow disciples and walkers on the same path, it becomes that little bit easier. I was very sort of reassured by some research that came out which said that individual action that you may take, if you talk about it and share about it, it does have an impact on other people because we are all a collective and we all learn from each other. And so taking it from that perspective and working in collaboration, I think helps to ease that kind of paralysis sometimes that we feel.
And Caleb, how about you?
Yeah, it reminds me of something I was thinking about recently, again, as I was just back in my own alley, picking up other people's trash. I think part of that paralysis is the result of the goal being too big for us. It really is. I mean, we can't save the world ourselves. Yeah. We can't save the world with the help of our friends. Yeah. It's too big of a problem. But we also, probably all of us in this room, we still have a really strong sense that we need to do something, right? And so how do we separate that kind of what salvation looks like from what we're able to do? Because those are probably two different things. And as I was just outside, I started thinking about whether what I was doing was a bit like hospice care or something, right? And maybe the way that Christians have thought about that as an area of ministry over time, because for us, the salvation is not ours to provide, right? But care is, right? And so it's making the goal slightly different. So we can appreciate what care looks like within that context, within a context where we understand that the world needs salvation, and we can name some of the reasons for that. We can identify what some of the problems are, and we can take steps to fix some of those, right? Like we can. Restoring a local park is an achievable goal, and maybe a way that getting global, fossil fuels under control is maybe not so achievable. So there's kind of a gradient to what we can accomplish, but at the same time, we're not just revitalizing our natural parks because we're trying to save the world or even trying to save our city, but we're trying to put care into something in a way that when you put care into something, what you're doing is tangibly kind of recognizing the value that's already in it. And so as you're thinking about creation that God has made out of love, to put your love back into it is kind of meeting God there in that place. It's not trying to take God's salvific role. It's not trying to sort of accomplish salvation on God's behalf, but it's still a witness. It's a witness to the kind of God that you're following as a disciple.
So there's an awful lot to think about there. Thank you both so much for your contributions today. Hannah, what actions are we suggesting this month around the theme of creation?
Well, there's all sorts of things you can do, and I hope that this podcast gave you some ideas based on the stories that Grace and Caleb have shared. One of them might be that you might want to organise a litter pit. We've talked a lot about the value of your local parks and green spaces. Perhaps you could think about cutting down your car or plane use. Grace has incredibly even given up one of her family cars. Now, not all of us can do that, but maybe there are ways that you can find alternative forms of transport for some of your journeys. And perhaps that we can also think about our food as another big contributor to our carbon footprint. So perhaps for you it's cutting out maybe 1 or 2 meat meals a week. Perhaps you've already started that journey and you might want to think about how you can incorporate more vegetarian and vegan meals into your diet. And finally, something we've been thinking a lot about is this issue of living in an age of protest and activism and the need for real political change around this issue. So if that's resonated with you while you've been listening today, then perhaps you can write to your MP. It's a lot easier to do than you might think. You can just Google write to your MP and you can take it from there and perhaps let them know that you and your church are really passionate about this issue.
So thank you all so much for listening to More Than Sunday. Don't forget you can get in touch with us in lots of different ways. You can email us at morethansunday@manchester.anglican.org, tweet using the hashtag MoreThanSunday, or in fact use that hashtag on Instagram as well, or join our Facebook discipleship group. Just search More Than Sunday and share your stories and encourage each other. We want this to be a community experience and something that we all journey on together. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you. We'll be back next month when our theme will be forgiveness.
Thank you.
Bye.